Welcome back to the third part. Yes, the third part of One Man's Faith today. Hey, glad you could join me again. And go ahead, sip on that coffee for a little while as we look here. Now we're looking at Paul's journey to Galatia. It happened to be his first missionary journey. Okay, so he left Pisidian Antioch and went to Iconium. When he was there, it says he went to the synagogue and spoke in such a manner, it says, that a great multitude believed. However, the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren. And it says that Paul and Barnabas spent a long time, verse 3, speaking boldly upon the Lord, who was testifying to the word of his grace, granting that signs and wonders be done at their hand. You see, the Lord backs up his word. Jesus and God back up the word. They back it up by doing signs and wonders. Christianity really is the only, if I can use the word, religion that has power behind the word. Because God will back up his word with signs and wonders. That's how, in a sense, you prove the word. It's not just through talking. It's not just through saying God loves you. You can show God loves you by signs and wonders. Laying hands on people, having them healed, praying over them, and allowing prophecy and some of the other gifts to work in their lives so that you speak into their lives and help them along the way. You tell them things that they did not know, or that only they knew and you didn't know. So God will back up his word by signs and wonders. But the people got divided. The Jews were instigating people, and it said that the multitude of the city was divided, verse 4 of chapter 14, and some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles, and when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews to mistreat and stone Paul and Barnabas, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding region. So they left that area because they were threatening to stone them. So they go to Lystra, and that's the next town in line with. You've got Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and there's Derbe over there. So they were in Lystra, and Paul was teaching, and there was a man in the midst who was lame from birth, kind of similar to the lame man that Peter and John ran into when they were at the temple in Jerusalem. And it says that the man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze upon him and had seen that he had faith to believe. In other words, Paul was looking around, he saw this guy, and he saw that the guy had faith. He saw that. And when he saw that, Paul said with a loud voice, "Stand up on your feet." And the lame man leaped up and began to walk. Well, in Lystra, there were many who didn't know the Lord and were serving other gods, and they said, "The gods have visited us." And they called Paul Zeus, and Hermes. They called Paul Hermes, and they called Barnabas Zeus. And when Paul and Barnabas heard this, they tore their clothes and said, No, we're just men. We're walking in the power of the Lord. And so after they kind of got them calmed down, the Jews that had come from Antioch, in other words, there were Jewish people that followed them to cause them trouble. They won over the multitudes, the Jewish people, and they stoned Paul, took him out of the city, and left him for dead. And it said that while the disciples stood around him, Paul arose and went back into the city. And after that, the next day, he went to Derbe, the other town that I just showed you, and he preached the gospel, and there were many that were saved and started to become disciples there. And so they went back through Lystra and Iconium and the Pisidian Antioch, and then they left and came back to the Antioch in Syria, and they told the church what had happened and the things that had transpired. Now, I did all that just to give you a general overview. I went through it very quickly so that you could see that Paul had gone up into this area. Now, it's after this, we don't know when exactly he wrote Galatia, but it was after he visited. And as you can see, they were fighting already with this thing of what the Jews wanted them to do, even if, as they accepted the Lord. And Paul kept trying to say, no, you're free. You're free. It actually ended up that he had to go to Jerusalem and defend what he told the Gentile people, that they need to serve the Lord, but they didn't have to obey or walk by the law because they weren't called to. The law was given specifically to the Jewish people. And so Paul was saying, no, you just break away from serving other gods and you serve the one true God. The Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the original covenant that we have is there for us so that we can know who God is and see where God's heart is. We are not called to have service on Friday night into Saturday, what our Jewish brothers and sisters call the Sabbath. We're not called to have to do that. But we are called to serve the Lord and to worship Him, which we normally do on Sunday, which happened to be the day after the Sabbath, i.e. the day Jesus arose. And so we have a day of Sabbath. Ours is Sunday, where our Jewish brothers and sisters and some others have it on Friday night to Saturday night. Okay? So, out of what we just looked at, let's look at 7 things. Good number, huh? 7 things that we can get out of this, all right? The first one is this. You've been called, so walk in it. You, one looking at me right now on a television screen. You have been called. God has called you. Paul knew that he'd been called, okay? He says in Galatians 1, Paul, an apostle. Okay, he'd been called. He said he was not sent from men, but through Jesus Christ, God the Savior. In other words, nobody laid hands on Paul. He was not a disciple of Jesus because Jesus had died before Paul got involved. All right? And Paul was very zealous. And Paul knew that this Jesus movement was a heresy. And so he started to go after those that are called Christians. And that's when God, or Jesus himself, struck Paul on the road to Damascus and said, Paul, why do you persecute me? And that was the conversion of Paul. It was the Lord that converted him. It's very possible from what Paul writes that for at least those 3 days until Ananias came to him, the Lord ministered to him and showed him things and showed him things and showed him things, kind of brought him up to snuff. Paul also went away for, I think it was 14 years, and studied. And it was when things started to happen in Antioch, Barnabas said, hey, Paul needs to be involved in this. And Barnabas went to Tarsus, found him, and brought him back. And that's where chapter 13 starts up. They were ministering together at the church in Antioch. So you are called. Paul was called. You are called. Matthew 28:19, we call it the Great Commission. It says, go, make disciples, teach them to observe all. Teach them to observe all that I, Jesus, commanded you. Okay? We have that commission upon us to go and make disciples. That's a calling on our lives. 1 Corinthians 14 says, pursue love, yet desire earnestly the supernatural, especially that you may prophesy. Each one of us has been given a gift. It's called the gifts of the Spirit. It is for the common good. It is for us to use in our congregations. Prophecy, gifts of healing, faith, miracles, knowledge, wisdom, speaking in tongues in church, along with interpretation, which is a form of prophecy when those two are together. Discerning of spirits. These are all gifts, supernatural gifts, that are given to the church, to each person, to use so that we can all be edified and grow up in the ways of the Lord. You've been called. Walk in it. Okay, I got to take one more break, so let's take that break, and I'll be right back.